Established in 1965, the United Nations Development Programme works alongside UN member states to create solutions. According to the UN, conflict is the main driver of humanitarian needs, followed by natural disasters. Overall, more than 135 million people worldwide are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. And at least $25 billion is required to meet those challenges. But given the various crises faced by many countries, is development even possible? We will find out more from Achim Steiner. The head of the UN Development Programme talks to Al Jazeera.
Mr. Achim Steiner, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. I'd like to start by asking you about the annual report published by the UNDP, which measures development in each country around the world. According to your findings published for 2018, the bottom 5 countries are Burundi, Chad, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Niger. All of those are in Africa. Why is that?
Well, again, it might be tempting to say there is an African syndrome here, but I would not advocate that. I think each one of these countries is facing challenges. Central African Republic, essentially strife, conflict, and the falling apart of many of the structures that actually would sustain development. In a country such as Chad, we have, first of all, the challenge that it is a vast country. To this day, central government services in education and health don't even reach a significant part of the population. So we are essentially dealing with countries that either are still at a very early stage of putting the basic infrastructure, human, but also in terms of services, access to electricity, health, education, in place. And then we have countries that are really falling apart again over civil strife, conflict, or wars. And unfortunately, a significant number of those countries still are found on the African continent.
Geography's got to be playing a part in it, because there are those countries that have similarities in the sense that they were former colonies, or that they were maybe not so rich in the beginning, or had their wealth maybe taken away, like India, for example, which is doing a lot better in terms of development measures. Why is it that in Africa you're still finding that very slow development, if not zero development? Is there a lack of interest? Is it because certain governments aren't paying attention? Is it more difficult to generate? What's the reasons for that?
Well, let me again say, I don't think there is a generic judgment on development in Africa. We have countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique in the last 10 years. I mean, these are success stories. Another one being Rwanda, where governance reform, investment in education, development of infrastructure, functioning markets and regulatory frameworks, accountability of government, functioning parliaments. Those are the ingredients of success of development, and you find them across Africa as you would in other continents. And let me also remind you that, when we look at some disastrous development implosions, they're not only in Africa. The situation that we find in some countries in the Middle East, parts of Central America, and even in parts of Asia still, there are countries with extreme poverty. And I would simply say Africa is a vast continent, and one often forgets that if you take a map and compare it to other parts of the world, it is bigger than most people imagine, and it is more than 50 countries. So I would still say, look at each African country in terms of its own reality and history, and you will discover that there are different drivers that explain whether they are success stories in development or perhaps failures.
When it comes to challenges of success, it's not obviously simply limited to issue of resources, corruption, or bad governance. A key reason for lack of development is war and conflict. And the 3 countries that have witnessed the steepest decline in development, as you mentioned, are actually in the Middle East. You're talking about Syria, Libya, and Yemen. All 3 are Arab countries, and all 3 witnessed protests calling for greater freedom and democracy in 2011, as what was then or later billed as the Arab Spring. I want to start by Yemen, with Yemen, and it's been described as the worst humanitarian disaster of our time. Who is responsible for this?
Well, let us begin with the fact that in every war there are at least 2 sides. Each one will blame the other. It's not different in Yemen. I think from the perspective of a development program of the United Nations, we go back to the root causes. And much of what you just alluded to also in terms of the Arab Spring was in fact something that the United Nations Development Programme Human Development Reports began to anticipate already at the time of the Arab Spring in the years before. There is a very often cited UNDP Human Development Report that actually began to recognize the ingredients of what happens in societies in countries if political consensus is lost. Conflict becomes part of dividing communities, whether on ethnic or religious lines.
Yes, there are two sides, but there's always maybe a more powerful side, a more responsible side or something. And by this, not necessarily one country or government, but it could be even institutions and so forth. If you were to maybe identify what are the main reasons or drivers, who's preventing maybe work to be done, or which kind of mechanisms need to exist in order for that crisis to end and for the development to begin again, what would that be?
Well, first of all, let us recognize that Yemen has been a country, a nation that has been challenged by geographical realities already for many decades. By different also tribal affiliations. So there is within Yemen always a potential there for competition and conflict to also dominate national politics. Now into that kind of combustion situation come also regional perspectives. I mean, you know, we're all very familiar with the kind of tensions that are now dominating the Middle East, and I think you have seen parties from different sides becoming engaged in Yemen. Now, the argument being that we are invited, we are asked to assist, we are requested to provide support. But at the end of the day, let me go back to the root causes. And most of the time, when we end up in a conflict situation, there are two drivers. One, there are development failures that lead to people losing either confidence in their government or confidence in the ability to trust other interest groups in the country. And into that void or into that tension come then geographical, geopolitical interests from outside. And this is the classic story of Yemen. And when you say it is the largest humanitarian disaster today, yes, that is what the United Nations is saying to the world week after week, because what we're witnessing there is a catastrophe, first and above all for the people of Yemen, but it is also a catastrophe in developmental terms. This country is losing decades of the advancements that it had made, on top of which we have the humanitarian emergencies. So this is also why the Secretary General just now in Stockholm, my colleague Martin Griffiths, have been putting so much pressure on all parties to come back to the table. This conflict will never be solved by arms. It can be solved by compromise and above all by reinvesting in what were the original causes for the conflicts that have driven the tensions within the country and beyond that in the region.
Okay, let's move on to Libya. It's an oil-rich country. It has a very small population. On paper, it should be thriving, really. Why is it not?
Libya, post-Gaddafi, essentially was a political vacuum. Into that vacuum, the forces that differentiate interests in the country began to organize themselves. So today we have the remnants of a nation state with a central bank and an oil industry, for example, but we have no political consensus. The governance system of Libya essentially has imploded. In that vacuum, what we are witnessing right now is a continuous set of conflicts being used to establish and assert power, control over certain parts of the country. Unfortunately, some people are making a lot of money in this vacuum and therefore have little interest in allowing a national governance structure and a democratic process to be reestablished.
So this is the question. I mean, Libya, out of all the Arab Spring countries, had a UN resolution which allowed for international intervention. If the United Nations is capable of passing these resolutions for intervention, when there is this political vacuum, as you say, surely it should be the United Nations stepping up to ensure that any roadmap or political consensus strategy is implemented, rather than it saying, well, this isn't our responsibility, leave it to unfold however it is. And when it unfolds badly, as it has in Libya in terms of armed conflict, then the cost and burden on you is even greater, because not only are you trying to fill a void, but you're also trying to clean up the mess and the damage and destruction and kind of regression that has occurred as a result.
Which is precisely why Secretary General Antonio Guterres continuously and repeatedly is advocating for the United Nations to be recognized as a major force for prevention and not simply as a kind of global ambulance or fire service, which we often are. But let me also say, my staff in the United Nations Development Programme, but also of our sister agencies, are in Libya today. Some of them at great risk to themselves, working precisely to try and re-establish the conditions under which Libya can become a nation state that is governed through a democratic process, where its government institutions function again. But our dilemma has always been, we cannot force a nation or its conflicting parties at gunpoint to exercise good governance and the rule of law. Now, yes, member states passed a resolution, a whole series of political events took place. What we are left with right now is a situation that I think all of us consider to be fairly disastrous. And into that void, or into this chaotic situation, very often the United Nations is then asked to step in and perform miracles. And it cannot do these miracles. It needs the international community, and it needs the domestic parties to be willing to come to the table. Now, it sometimes takes painfully long to get to that point, but more often than not, it does eventually happen.
If I cite Syria, the third country there, that war's gone on now for what? More than seven years now, right?
7 painful years, yeah.
And essentially with all the massacres and the destruction, the entire infrastructure of the country is basically non-existent anymore. And still people haven't come to that realization that they need to find a political solution, even though they've met, and not for want of trying, at least from the UN's perspective. What kind of work are you doing in Syria right now, or are you able even to do?
Well, our ability to be engaged in Syria is premised, first of all, on being able to operate across the country. This already poses challenges right now, because different forces obviously exercise different degrees of control. Our ability has been also partly constrained by many of the political tensions with the international community. Having said that, UNDP has been present in Damascus throughout this period. Mm-hmm. We are engaged in the collaboration with the humanitarian agencies, and in particular to try to help communities with emergency programs, re-establishing basic services, so that first of all those affected by the conflict have an ability to return or stay in the towns and villages they are. Secondly, for what is likely to be a growing number of people returning to the country, to have something to return to. Now, as of now, there clearly is a challenge for any international agency, because on the one hand, those who are being asked to finance this are saying, until a political settlement is found, we do not wish to engage in reconstruction activities. On the other hand, everybody realizes that there are masses of people who could benefit from basic community rehabilitation schemes, and ultimately we have to help tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to also re-establish their livelihoods. So in a sense, we are in a whole position where we're trying to help with the humanitarian emergency support. We are looking at where we can already do some stabilization work, particularly with communities with very simple measures on the ground. But until we have a political settlement in the country, the work that UNDP would do with Syria is essentially very constrained.
You mentioned earlier efforts by the Secretary General to transform the United Nations in terms of making it more about prevention as well, so not simply just firefighting. Don't you think that countries that are doing the fighting in these conflicts, Syria, Yemen, Libya, others around the world, that are responsible for the killing, that are responsible for the destruction, shouldn't they be made to pay for the development of those countries afterwards? And I mean, obviously there's a political element of paying politically for what they've done, but also paying financially. And here I'm not only limiting it to those who are physically doing the fighting, countries that use their veto, countries that essentially allow for this to happen, or give political cover for it to happen. Surely maybe that is a way of at least firstly ensuring that the development happens, but also ensuring that maybe countries think twice before allowing for the destruction of whole societies.
Let me again not answer in one simple response to your question, because if you look at the last few years, we've actually seen a significant group of countries coming together, rehabilitation of Iraq, for example, the kind of support that is being pledged at conferences for Lebanon. What we see there is also countries in the region beginning to step up with $500 million, $1 billion in financial contributions. So first of all, I want to recognize these countries for what they have done, because it is not only Europe or the United States or Japan, In fact, we have seen quite a number of countries coming to the table. But that is, let's say, taking responsibility as an international community. Payments based on accountability or responsibility will always be very difficult to invoke. The United Nations is not a world government. It does not have the authority, except when it is exercised through the Security Council, to actually enforce a decision with its member states. So we build, first of all, on what is international law. We build on the good offices of the Secretary General, and we build also on the international community to actually respect the kinds of decisions that it passes in the Security Council or in the General Assembly. Now, this very often is the soft law of international law, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to make sure that even when some countries do not accept their responsibility or step up to the table when they could assist, that we do not punish the country by saying, well, then the others will not step up to the table either. This is a moral dilemma that is not very helpful.
One of the world's longest standing conflicts, the illegal occupation of Palestine. And I want to ask you specifically about Gaza, which has been under siege now for a decade. It's been subjected to several weeks also of airstrikes and bombardments in 2008, 2012 and 14. According to your findings, Gaza's economy has been virtually stagnant for the past 10 years, right? With the average annual GDP rate essentially barely exceeding 1%. Gaza's population, meanwhile, has grown by 38% over that same period. And according to the report that you published, there's a lot more GDP that's required in order to reduce the economic burden. You're talking about 40% unemployment there and so forth. It's very clear that the main issue of suffering in Gaza is the siege on Gaza. If there was free trade, there would be jobs, there would be money coming in and so forth. Why has the United Nations or the UNDP not come out and called for an immediate lifting of the siege?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge that the situation inside Gaza is desperate. And it is perhaps one of the most painful visits I have ever undertaken in my work around the world, to see that situation. And it is one that is also getting worse. You mentioned some of the factors. Not only are there more people, there are also challenges about lack of employment, access to clean water, for instance, the collapse of the aquifer. There are factors here that are going to make things far worse in the years to come. But as we all know, I mean, the reality of Gaza is embedded in a larger conflict that seems to be, eluding all efforts to resolve them. The United Nations has repeatedly, as you know, passed resolutions that has not only drawn attention to this, that has condemned aspects of that reality. And I will say it in those terms because at the end of the day, the resolutions are not the problem, it's the consequence in actually acting.
But even forget about the condemnation here. It's not about putting blame. What I want to know is you're seeking solutions, right, in order to make development. So let's not even, you can have something that's very simply worded. The siege essentially is making life impossible, development impossible, unemployment increase. As the United Nations, we would like the siege to be lifted, even if that means borders that are governed by blue helmets, even if it means that there are trade agreements that will be stipulated by international law and agreed on by a third party. It doesn't have to get bogged down into the whole Israel-Palestine conflict at all. It doesn't even have to mention anything about peace talks or final status, nothing. Simply, there are 2 million people living in the world, what's been described as the world's largest open-air prison. They have barely 4 hours of electricity a day. There's no way development is going to happen there.
Well, first of all, let us both agree that the UN has written many reports that actually not only describe the situation, but also present it in stark terms. So I think whether it is the High Commissioner for Human Rights, whether it is the General Assembly. So I think the United Nations is not found wanting in actually being able to tell the world that this situation is one that requires urgent attention in terms of the humanitarian needs, but also in terms of the longer term stability of the region as a whole. Secondly, we are invested there. In fact, there is a sister organization, as you know, UNRWA, that for decades now has been providing services to Palestinians in the region as a whole, that is currently being defunded and struggling to get the funding to keep these services going, providing schooling to tens of thousands of Palestinian children, medical facilities. We in the United Nations Development Programme are working in Gaza and are trying to in a sense, make an unbearable situation just slightly less unbearable. But at the end of the day, for all of us, the challenge is that this is a political conflict into which we cannot simply step in and believe that we can write reports that will make it go away. There is a need for a political solution. That political solution is not forthcoming, on the back of which millions of people are suffering. And I think the best thing that we are constantly trying to do as the United Nations, first of all, to provide humanitarian support, to provide development support where we can, but at the end of the day, it is in the political process that many presidents of many countries have also tried to move forward, that the solution will lie for this.
Finally, I just want to look ahead to the future, and it's estimated that currently a quarter of the world's population lives in poverty, around 1.3 billion people. Half of those are 18 years or younger. When you look at those numbers, it doesn't really look promising. But there are projects that you're doing and other ideas that are being worked on in order to increase development, and not only simply from the kind of one-dimensional aspect of material income, but also quality of living, freedom of expression, education, and so forth. How do you see the future in terms of challenges and opportunities?
Without in any way being too optimistic, I think with hope, because first of all, what we must not forget on the back of these numbers, which are in individual terms still dramatic numbers that affect individual lives, but the story of development over the last 100 years is a story of phenomenal progress and success. The UNDP Human Development Report that you cited earlier on has documented this progress over the last 25, 30 years. But let me just give you one example. 150 years ago or 200 years ago, 1 billion people lived on this planet. At that time, 9 out of 10 people alive lived in extreme poverty. Today we have 7 billion people and only 1 out of 10 lives in extreme poverty. We have gone through an extraordinary period of development. People live longer, more people read and write, we have better nutrition, life expectancy. Our possibilities today are phenomenal compared even to those 3-4 generations ago. So the first message that I have to those who always say, oh, development, it never works, the Sustainable Development Goals are just abstract goals, take a look at history and ask yourself, how has progress been made possible? People had a vision, they set themselves goals, we invested in the future. We are today a generation that is actually in a position to eliminate extreme poverty. It's the first time we can say that in history. Now, will it happen? A lot depends on what a lot of people will do. But our role as the United Nations, as the United Nations Development Programme, is to do everything possible to focus that in development, no one is left behind. We can use modern data, artificial intelligence, allow governments to understand where are the people living who are not having access to services. How do we deal with, for instance, service provision for people with disability, often overlooked in the development process, gender equity, education of girls. We can find ways in which we can make development far more targeted today, and that is the power of technology that is coming to it. But it is also a matter of political priorities, of governments willing to invest their budgets, and perhaps of asking ourselves, how much more money are we going to invest in the elusive notion that militaries guarantee our national security when poverty and destitution and the sense of unfairness have actually been at the heart of virtually every civil strife, conflict in the last 20 years. We need to invest in development. We need to invest in making sure that people are not left behind. Look at the societies who are succeeding today. They are the ones who have taken that paradigm on board, and that shapes the development journey of these countries.
Mr. Achim Steiner, head of the United Nations Development Programme, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Jamal.